Welcome to this week's episode of Tasting Together. My name is Pat Fahey. I'm a Master Cicerone, and I'm the content director for the Cicerone certification program. And I see a lot of familiar folks in the chat, but as I always like to at the start, if anybody is not familiar, we get together every Wednesday, 4 p.m. Central, talk a little bit about some topic from the wide canon of different beer topics, preferably with beer in hand. So hopefully you're able to have a beer while you are watching this. Hopefully you're able to taste the style that we're talking about, but if not, any beer will do. So I believe last week we had Neil on here talking about Helles. So if you missed that, that was a fun and rousing session. Be sure to check it out. If this is your first time, I always like to remind people, ask questions as we go. I won't necessarily get to your questions as you send them through, but I'll make sure that I get to them before the end of the session. In terms of things coming up, the only thing we have on the schedule is next week right now. September 2nd, we'll be doing German Pils, which should be a lot of fun. By that date, we'll have the September schedule locked in, and we'll announce at that point. I saw somebody throw out a suggestion for Oktoberfest, which seems fitting to hit at least sometime in the month of September, so that'll probably make an appearance in there. More calls for Oktoberfest. So yeah, I think it sounds like a good idea to me. I think that'd be a fitting style to talk about given the time of year. So this week we are going to be talking about American Porter. And I've already seen some people throw out what they're drinking, but if you haven't already, let us know what you're drinking in the comments. I am having a Bell's Porter. Classic, delightful. I'm enjoying it so far. And in terms of glassware, I wouldn't necessarily put this, if I was a bar serving a porter, I probably wouldn't put it in a tulip. Most American styles, like the classic, so to speak, glass style is just a standard shaker pint. But shaker pints aren't very sexy and they don't do very much for a beer. So, I prefer maybe something like what's called a tulip pint. It's like that's the shape of the classic Guinness glass that has a little bit more curvature to it, or like a nonic pint glass, which is the glass that looks kind of like a shaker pint, except it has a little bulge up near the top. Either that or like a pub mug. So a lot of the styles of glassware that you'd see used for traditional UK styles, I think, work pretty well for American porter style of beer. But all of the pub mugs, nonic pints, and tulip pints that I have at home are branded, and I, at least on camera, don't like to do a different beer to mix up the branded glassware with a different beer. When I'm just drinking on my own, it's whatever. But yeah, I went with my safe unbranded tulip glass, which I do love. So to start things off, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the American porter style. And in order to talk about American porter, we have to talk a little bit about British or English porter. I don't want to go into kind of like the entirety of the English porter story because there's a lot there, but I'll just try to hit some of the high points because I think they're essential to really understanding how this style came about. So in the 1700s, UK, like maybe first quarter of the 1700s was when we believed that porter was invented or came to be. By the mid 1700s, it was far and away the most popular style of beer being consumed in London. It derived its name, the story goes that it derived its name from porters. Porters were basically working class people that carried stuff around. And so it derived its name from its popularity amongst the working class. And that porter, the porter of the 1700s, was a very different beer than really any beer that we have today, but definitely very different beer than what we think of as porter today. A couple things that were sort of important in the way that that beer was made. It would have been made entirely with a brown malt. Pale malts at that point in time, it was possible to make pale malts, but it was very expensive. And so to get its kind of its color and its flavor, that would have been produced using brown malt. Because of malting technology at the time, it probably would have been kind of smoky. And then another aspect of that style of beer specifically is that it was typically made by blending fresh beer with beer that had been vatted or aged in wood. And due to total lack and even total lack of understanding of how microbiology worked at that point in time, that vatted beer probably would have been like reasonably acidic, probably some amount of like acetic vinegar character, some Brettanomyces character as well, would have been like more in line with what you'd think of being made at a Belgian brewery producing Flanders Red than what we think of as porter today. So that beer would have been very, very different. But began to change. Probably the first kind of big change that occurred in that style of beer was in the late 1700s. Excuse me. I was feeling parched. Late 1700s was when brewers began using hydrometers. Hydrometer is a tool that's still used by brewers today. It's used to measure the density of a liquid. And the reason that brewers use hydrometers is they use it to measure, they use the density of wort after mashing and boiling as a stand-in to estimate how much sugar they were able to get from their malt. And when brewers started using the hydrometer, they found out that they didn't get very much sugar from the brown malt during the kilning process where you're developing that color and that flavor. You also end up kind of cooking up some of those sugars. Some of those sugars get consumed and aren't then usable for or fermentable by yeast later to produce alcohol. So what they found was that even though pale malts at the time were more expensive to produce, they got so much more sugar out of them that it was more economically efficient to use pale malt than it was to use brown malt. And so brewers started to supplement their porter recipes with some amount of pale malt. What you saw happen is the color and the flavor obviously would have changed, and consumers complained about that. At the time, much as today, I think dark color was sort of viewed as emblematic of the beer's strength. That's a pretty common misconception today. I see all the time people talking about like Guinness Draft, for example, is like this really strong, rich, robust beer just because it's like black and opaque, when in reality it's pretty thin and it's like 4% alcohol. So, when consumers saw the beer diminishing in color, they looked at that as the beer being watered down, and they were not accepting of that. And what really kind of changed porter formulation in a big way was, this event that a lot of people point back to, the 1817 invention of the roasting drum. A guy named Daniel Wheeler invented this patented roasting drum that allowed him to produce malts that were like truly black in color. Prior to the invention of the roasting drum, if people tried to kiln malts to that high of a degree, you get to a point where the malt was so dry and so hot that it would just like spontaneously combust. It would just burst into flames. And so the kind of the movement and some of the conditions that are present in the roasting drum allowed them to achieve really high temperatures, produce really, really dark malts that could be used alongside pale malt to still produce a very, very dark beer. For anybody who's ever homebrewed, or if you have any understanding of recipe formulation, with the black malts that brewers have access to today, it doesn't take much more than like 4 or 5% of a really black malt to make a black beer. Those malts are so concentrated in terms of the color and the roasted flavor that they bring to a beer. And so brewers are able to produce a beer that is largely pale malt with a little bit of roast barley, black patent malt, and make a beer that is black in color. And that's what brewers did. So post the invention of the roasting drum and the introduction of black patent malt, brewers reformulated porters to be mostly pale ale malt or some sort of pale malt, so that they got that kind of high efficiency from that grain, and then a small amount of darker or heavily roasted malt. And that, that would have kept the color about the same, but would have drastically changed the flavor of that beer. And porter at that point became more akin to the porters that we run into today. But not too long after that, porter began sort of a slow slide or descent in terms of its popularity. IPA, if I recall correctly, IPA was first called India Pale Ale in like the 1830s, but paler, hoppier, bitter beers started to come into favor around the beginning of the 1800s. And then by mid 1800s, IPA was definitely the sort of the it beer in the UK beer scene. So porter from that point on kind of just slowly declined in popularity from the mid 1800s on through the mid 1900s, to the point where, as a style, porter essentially died out in the UK. There were no brewers producing porter for a period in time. And one of the things that I always like to bring up or point out that I think is really emblematic of this, you think about the Guinness brewery. Guinness is known worldwide for their stout. When Guinness was founded as a porter brewery, and Guinness brewed a porter up until like the 1970s, but they stopped making their porter at that point just because the style had become so unpopular. So what happened, what brought porter back to life, was actually the American craft beer movement, interestingly enough. So early on, early American craft brewers, think like early 1980s, were largely coming out of the homebrewing scene, and that homebrewing scene at the time relied pretty heavily on British brewing texts to learn how to brew. And so when they were looking for different styles to make, in a lot of cases, they were sort of mining historic British styles. A lot of what we think of today as like core American styles, American Pale Ale, American IPA, these are American renditions of British styles. Porter is exactly the same way. So American brewers in the early 80s began producing sort of their take on on a porter style beer, and a resurgence in popularity around that style led to some breweries in the UK beginning to produce porter again. And at this point, porter is a style that is very much around. There are a number of breweries that make porters, both in the US and abroad. It's worth noting, in the BJCP guidelines, two of the porter styles used to be robust porter, which was kind of this roastier porter that featured some of those more heavily roasted malts, and brown porter, which was a bit less roasty, bit softer in terms of its overall characteristics. I hesitate to say that it like harkened back to that invention of black patent malt porter, because it wasn't a product that was vatted or smoky or any of those things. But brown porter would be a porter that was, just a little bit softer, a little bit less roasty, a little less bitter. In the 2015 update to the BJCP guidelines, they renamed those styles as English porter and American porter. to sort of reflect that this far roastier and somewhat more bitter take on porter is an Americanization of the style. It's like what Americans have done with most of the styles that we've adapted. We make them like a little bit more intense, a little bit either like more bitter or more hoppy, or if it's a roasty beer, we just make them more. It's our way. So American porter is reflective of the fact that it comes from the porter tradition, but it is a roastier, more bitter, more assertive take on the style. So let's talk a little bit about what goes into an American porter, what ingredients are used. Now, American porter, first and foremost, it's a malty beer. This is a beer where the flavor profile is almost entirely driven by its malt characteristics. And not every beer that is a malty beer has a complex grain bill. You can think of a beer like Doppelbock, where it definitely brings a lot of malt complexity to the table, but in a lot of cases that could be made entirely from just Munich malt. It could be just one single malt used to make that beer. Porters don't necessarily go crazy, and like it's one of the things, if you read about porter recipes, people are like, don't go crazy, don't use like 12 different malts in this beer. But it usually accommodates several kinds of malt in its production. For its base, it's usually going to be like pale ale malt or even just like two-row malt. So once again, something pale is making up the majority of the base. But brewers will often use a bit of Munich malt to add some kind of additional toast flavor, or, build a little bit of that character into the base. And then several different types of specialty malt are common in this beer. Usually some amount of crystal malt, which is going to bring both sweetness and potentially a little bit of like caramel or toffee type flavor to the beer. And then obviously something for that dark color. And brewers have a lot of options there, but the most common are usually going to be like chocolate malt, and then probably also some black patent malt. Black patent malt is significantly darker than chocolate malt, brings significantly more color to the party. Other options that brewers have, sometimes brewers will use carafa malts, which are referred to sometimes as debittered malts. They have, I believe, the husks removed so that they don't give such an intense roasty character to the beer. They contribute more of that color without sort of the acrid or burnt notes. And then also sometimes breweries will use roasted barley in making these beers. And some people kind of draw the distinction that like porters are made with black patent malt, stouts are made with roasted barley. That's not a real distinction. Brewers can use either one in either of those styles. So there isn't really a very clean distinction between all stouts and all porters, unfortunately. It's just the way it is. Beyond the malt, a lot of the other ingredients used in producing porter reflect sort of its descent from UK traditions, in that for both hops and yeast, at least the style guidelines accommodate either American hops and yeast or UK hops and yeast, or in the case of hops, at least a mix of the two. So hop flavor and aroma isn't usually a super prominent part of the profile, though some versions will feature some amount of hop aroma and can even be dry hopped in some cases. But in a lot of cases, hop flavor and aroma plays very much a secondary role to the malt flavor and aroma. And like I said, the hops could be traditional American varieties. They could be traditional UK varieties. Could go either way depending upon how the brewer felt. Same thing for yeast. If the brewer is using an American ale strain, you're going to see a much cleaner fermentation with very little fermentation flavor. If they're fermenting with a UK strain, you might see a bit more ester character. I'd say diacetyl in this style, which is kind of some UK strains will produce some amount of diacetyl. Most people probably wouldn't be super accepting of diacetyl in the style of beer, but you could still get some of the higher levels of ester character that you sometimes see with English ale yeast strains. But once again, totally up to the brewer, totally at their discretion. Just need to top up my beer. So in this porter specifically, sorry, I keep wanting to like fall out. In this porter that I am drinking, it really doesn't have a lot in the way of hopper use character. It really is like just all about the malt profile. And it covers a wide segment of sort of like the darker types of malt flavors that you can see. So there's kind of like some brown bread or like lightly toasty notes in here. There's also a bit of kind of like a nuttiness, almost like a pecan or walnut even. It has a lot of different chocolate or cocoa notes. Like there's like a cocoa powder. There's kind of like a dry, dark chocolate flavor to it. Not crazy roasty. It doesn't go. And when I say like roasty, talking about just like anything flavor wise from like chocolate through coffee onto burnt acrid espresso coffee grounds. This sticks to kind of the lighter end of the roast spectrum. It has a lot of different chocolate notes, but I don't really get much in the way of anything that I would think of as like coffee-like or espresso-like, and certainly isn't exhibiting any burnt flavors or aromas. American porters can go in that direction. You know, one that we have used on exams and in training a lot is the Founders Porter. It's a beer I love very much. Definitely far on the roasty end of the spectrum for the style. That beer does flirt with kind of that burnt end of the roast spectrum. This one's a little bit softer. It's a little bit lighter in character, at least in roast character. As for does anyone actually like diacetyl? You know, in the right place, I can accept it. I'm pretty sensitive to diacetyl, and I pretty strongly don't like it. But like Pilsner Urquell is a beer that I very much love, and that beer has a significant amount of diacetyl to it. So I can't explain that, but in the right time and place, I can accept it. So finish up, talk a little bit about pairing. American porters I find to be a pretty versatile beer for pairing. You know, they're roasty, but they're still relatively light and drinkable. I didn't talk much about like mouthfeel characteristics or taste characteristics of this one, which I should have, but like bitterness is moderate, maybe moderate pronounced. So reasonably soft on the bitterness front, you know, medium body, moderate carbonation. So it's still like a very drinkable beer. It's not as palate dominating as something like an Imperial Stout or even an American Stout. American Stouts can be pretty assertive in their character. So as a result, you know, they work really well. I like to cite like the backyard barbecue setting, like anything off a grill, burgers, anything with a little bit of char on it will marry up nicely with this sort of beer. Seared steak, obviously, it's really nice, but at the same time, it has enough heft to it that it pairs well with what I think of as like winter comfort food. Like if I wanted to like hunker down over some gravy soaked meatloaf or like a shepherd's pie, American porter once again would fit really well in that context. This is also a style that I really enjoy with food that has a little bit of chili heat to it. We talked about it, and this is an example where diacetyl was not welcome, but when I did the session on pairing with spicy food, the roasty beer that I had was a Guinness Born Extra Stout. That beer has a fair amount of diacetyl to it, and that sort of didn't make it as good of a companion to some of the dishes as I would have liked it to be. But I would love to try this beer alongside that jerk chicken. I think the roast character and kind of little bit of sweetness that the beer has would sync up really nicely with some of the spice character that you get in the spice rub on that dish. I also think that roast is one of those things. It can work well in some really surprising situations. I remember in particular one advanced Cicerone exam that we did. I typically will do the beer and food pairing oral exams for that test, and we had it was like a broccoli salad with like a mayonnaise based dressing, had raisins and red onion and a little bit of bacon, and the beer I picked for it was porter. And pretty much everybody, when they came in, were like, oh, this is not going to work. And it actually paired up really nicely. I think the roast character can play really well with some of those like cruciferous vegetables and some of those sulfury notes that you sometimes get from them. But then you look at some of the other elements there, and you have kind of the sweetness and dark fruit from the raisins, maybe a little bit of smoke from the bacon in that salad. And those things play really nicely with the roast character that's here. Roast takes really nicely to smoked things. So if you pair this up against something that is a smoky food, they tend to blend together rather well. Also like a beer like this with something like a nutty, well-aged cheese, like a 18-month or 3-year aged Gouda. I think in my experience, those cheeses will work really nicely here. And then also, as with most beers that exhibit some amount of roast, it's a style that works pretty well in the realm of dessert. A lot of people's first inclination is to just throw this at something like a chocolate dessert, which is fine. I've had good experiences with like chocolate desserts and roasty beers, but unless there's some other component going on in the dish, I feel like that can get a little too matchy-matchy. It just can be kind of boring. My preference would be to put a beer like this with probably a fruit-based dessert. Chocolate and fruit make very good partners, and this beer has a lot of chocolate character to it. So I think like a tart cherry pie or something like that would marry really nicely with this beer. So that is all I have to say. Let's see. I'll dig through. So first one I have is best way to differentiate between English Porter and American Porter. In just a sec. So kind of what I was talking about earlier, and maybe I kind of answered this already after the question was posed. I don't know when it came through. English porters are going to be significantly softer in terms of the amount of roast flavor that they bring to the party. In a lot of cases, those beers might be made with chocolate malt, but probably not black patent malt. And so they're more in kind of the nutty, toasty, mild chocolate, but not quite like heavy roast character that you tend to find in an American porter. They're also usually going to be a little bit less bitter than you'd find in an American porter, as is often the case with styles that we have taken. We add more hops when we interpret styles. Somebody asked for a brewery making English porter. Probably the most classic example that's not too hard to find is Sam Smith's Taddy Porter. That's a great example of the style. It can be hard to find really fresh, but it's a good example if you can find it. Otherwise, there aren't a ton. I mean, most even breweries in the UK that are making porters again are usually making them sort of more in what we today call this American style of porter, where they are a bit more sort of a bit roastier. Somebody asked about Tatty Porter being in clear glass. Not to my knowledge. I'm trying to think if any of Sam Smith's beers come in clear glass. That one is in brown glass for sure, though. Tom asked when Fuller's started making porter. And Shayna said 1999, maybe. Or they have awards at least dating to 1999. So some point in there. I would say that, and I believe Fuller's, it's the London Porter. It kind of straddles once again, like it's a little bit, it's reasonably roasty. Let's see. Tom asks, could you comment on a trend I see of porters that have been adding vanilla or peanut butter flavoring? Why do brewers think that is necessary? Why indeed? I'm not exactly sure what led to stouts and porters being the most kind of like adjuncted beers that I can think of. You know, the whole pastry stout phenomenon is a little bit newer, but people have been, I can think of like Breckenridge's flagship beer for, God, I don't know, at least more than a decade was their vanilla porter. I'm not sure exactly why they went that route, but you know, these darker beers exhibit a lot of chocolate flavors. I think what people are sort of doing is they're playing off of chocolate's natural affinity for other sorts of flavors. You know, chocolate works well with vanilla, works well with caramel, works well with peanut butter, works well with fruits, works well with spices. Think about like if you look at like the chocolate section or the chocolate aisle at Whole Foods, and you just like look at the different sorts of chocolate bars that people are producing, chocolate marries well with a huge variety of different flavors. So I think brewers, especially American brewers, naturally being sort of an experimenting type bunch, went down the road of testing different adjuncts or different additives for these beers that exhibit some of these chocolate flavor characteristics. The reason why as many brewers have done it as have is because consumers responded well to them. You know, people would not keep making these kinds of beers, or especially not the number of breweries that are making these sorts of beers, if they weren't enjoyed by a wide number of people. So me personally, I much prefer like an unadjuncted American porter to something that is time and place. I can definitely enjoy like a vanilla porter or even peanut butter porter, but I'm trying to think. I want to say there's a brewery down in Texas, might be in Austin, that has a pecan porter. It's really nice beer. I usually would prefer one that didn't have additional flavor to it, but there are a lot of consumers that do like that. So let's see. Caitlin asks, how frequently do you think artificial smoke flavor is added to make it more in American porters, or is that not very common? Artificial smoke flavor, I'm not really sure where a brewery would get like artificial smoke flavor from. If a brewery is, infusing smoke flavor into a beer, The most common way they're going to do it is with smoked malt, which isn't necessarily artificial in any way. Are there breweries that make porters with smoked malt? Yes, they're usually going to call it a smoked porter. Alaskan smoked porter is probably the number one example that comes to mind. But in a lot of cases, I would say it's probably just heavily roasted malts that are giving it kind of a smoky sort of flavor. As a anecdote, on the Master Cicerone exam, one of the tasting panels involves open style tasting, where you get a flight of beers and you have to assign a style to them with no kind of hints or anything guiding you. And I've seen happen a couple of times where we've put a beer like Guinness on, an Irish stout, and had, in one case, it was like between a third and a half of candidates called it a Rauch beer. So called it like a smoked beer. And that's because in part, like high levels of roasted malt can evoke sort of smoky, ashy flavors. So Tom throws out liquid smoke. There might be a brewery that's made a beer with liquid smoke. I kind of hope not, but given how brewers these days can and in some cases will put just about anything in, it certainly may have happened. I don't think so, but maybe. Other question is molasses character coming from crystal malt. I'd say if you're getting molasses character, that's probably where it's coming from. It's probably either crystal malt or a combination of like crystal malt and chocolate malt together, kind of producing those sort of like darker but still sweet molasses type tones. Let's see. Shana said, we got a couple questions about the difference between some style and an American porter. Difference between American porter and a Baltic porter. Baltic porter is a interesting beast of a style. It's a style that, at least up until craft brewers started making it recently, was mostly popular in like the Baltic countries. So it's a bit higher in alcohol. It's usually made with lager yeast. Usually has a bit of almost, it's not like made to have oxidized character to it, but it usually has a bit more of kind of like dark fruit and molasses type tones, maybe even a licorice tone to it that you might see in a beer that had developed a little bit of oxidative character. Also significantly less roasty. Oftentimes Baltic Porter is not going to be really heavily burnt in character. It's more, sometimes, and this isn't like, don't quote me super hard on this because it's not a perfect comparison, but I sometimes think about Baltic Porter as like a super scaled up version of a Schwarzbier, where, German Schwarzbier is a black lager style, but once again, made in a way where it's like true Schwarzbier should never be like roasty, have burnt character to it. It's usually just like maybe lightly chocolatey. Baltic Porter is sort of the same idea, but like 3 or 4 alcohol percentage points higher, potentially. Questions on American Stout versus American Porter. When you compare those two, especially if it's within the same brewery, American Stout is going to be more robust. It's going to be roastier, probably more likely to tend into that kind of like coffee and burnt end of the spectrum. It'll usually be higher in alcohol, probably more bitter as well. If you look at like the style guidelines on that, there's definitely overlap in the ranges, but American Stout tends a little bit higher, American Porter a little bit lower. And like when I think about like a brewery where you can compare the two, I think of like Sierra Nevada Porter and Sierra Nevada Stout, which are two classic examples of those styles. The Stout is a little bit more robust, a little bit hoppier, a little bit more bitter, a little bit roastier. So more. Chris wants to know what I would look for to distinguish between an American Porter and American Stout. That's tough, honestly. Like in a blind tasting, I could be wrong, but I am pretty sure that we, at least at the certified level and the advanced level, would not make you distinguish between an American porter and an American stout because there is a fair amount of overlap between the two. It's kind of like it's kind of in the same vein as trying to distinguish between American Pale Ale and American IPA, where they're very much part of the same family. They're similar styles. American IPA is a little bit more intense, but depending upon the brewery, like there's a lot of overlap. There are some American Pale Ales that are higher in alcohol and more bitter and more hop forward than beers that other breweries call their IPA. And the same thing is true with American Porter, American Stout. I look at Founders Porter, and I've definitely seen people call that an American Stout in blind tasting because it's so roasty. So if I had the two side by side, I would say the American Stout is probably going to be roastier, more bitter, and at least when I think about it, this isn't necessarily true of the styles, but I can call to mind American stouts that have more hop flavor and aroma, at least more so than I can with American porters. Like I think of Deschutes Black Butte versus Deschutes Obsidian Stout. Black Butte doesn't have a ton of hop flavor and aroma to it. Obsidian Stout is like pretty significantly hoppy. And same thing with Sierra Nevada Stout. It's not the main note, but it has a pronounced hop flavor and aroma to it. So that's another thing that at least anecdotally you might see, but that's a really tough distinction. One brewery's American Stout could be another brewery's American Porter. Caitlin asks, is there a particular porter that you would consider a textbook example of a porter? At least of the American porter style, some of the ones that I've talked about, and that's part of the issue is, with all styles or with almost all styles, I'm like, California Common. California Common is just Anchor Steam. There's one beer that is the prototype of that style. But with all styles, there's usually a range of allowable traits. And in the case of American Porter, I think what you see the most difference in from one example to the next is the amount of roast character, like how roasty it gets. Is it more kind of like dark chocolate, or is it more coffee, or is it more burnt? So I think Bell's Porter is a great example that shoots kind of down the middle on that front. I really like Founders Porter, and I would call it a textbook example of the style, but once again, it is a very, very roasty textbook example of the style. Deschutes Black Butte, trying to think off the top of my head where I feel like that falls, probably somewhere between these two. Edmund Fitzgerald from Great Lakes is another classic example, but that one is usually a little bit thinner than some of the other ones and is fairly roasty. Boulevard's Bully Porter. Does Boulevard even make Bully Porter? I don't even know if they still make it, but if they do, that's a great example of the style. So, that's a handful of different beers that I would consider to be really exemplary options of the style. But that brings up a really good point, and something that I really I haven't talked about a lot on these sessions, but that I do like to mention whenever I'm doing training is when you're trying to learn about a beer style, when you're first learning, obviously it's good to just get a sampling of the breadth of options out there. If you were like, I got to try 5 examples of every style, you'd get like bogged down 10 styles in and would just stop and be like, I can't do this. So like when you're just getting started learning about styles, it's good to do a broad sampling and, pick a classic example and kind of tie your expectations of the style to that example. But as you refine and develop your beer knowledge over time, which if you want to do that, this is what I'd recommend doing. For any style that you want to really get to understand, you got to try a few different versions of it. I'd say at least 3, but depending upon the style, you might develop new insights on it from the 4th or the 5th American Porter that you have. And because there's a range inherent in all styles, that will help give you a much better appreciation of what that style can be, rather than just thinking that like American Porter has to be this one beer. So yeah, I'd say if you want to know more about the style, if you're just getting started, start with any one of those. If you want to develop a more robust understanding of it, grab a few of them and taste them side by side. The more you taste, the more robust your understanding is going to become. Let's see what else there may or may not be. Got a question about allergies during a tasting exam. So how would allergies affect you during a tasting exam or practicing for a tasting exam? I guess it depends what you're allergic to. One of the things that we, at least on the certified exam, we don't put any, like the certified Cicerone exam doesn't have any beers in it that have like crazy ingredients. Usually it's just classic styles. At the advanced and master level, the beers that are possibly present open up to just about anything. But one of the things that we do, in part because we also have this beer and food section, is we ask for any allergies or dietary restrictions. And so if we have somebody sitting the exam that's like, I'm deathly allergic to peanut butter, we're not going to put a peanut butter porter on that exam. Same thing goes if you're like lactose intolerant. I would always say, especially if you do have an allergy and you're trying to prep for a tasting exam, reach out and let us know ahead of time so that we can make sure that we accommodate that. But we usually do a pretty good job of trying to make sure that we've tried to solicit that information from people so that we're not serving somebody a beer blind that they would have a bad reaction to. In terms of them affecting kind of like your learning or your practicing, I think probably the most common one that comes up is lactose intolerance for things like milk stouts. And I would say you can still understand most of the characteristics of something like a milk stout by reading up on it and reading up on how it's different from other related styles, and then sort of imagining what it would taste like while tasting one of those related styles. And that would probably be sufficient to develop an understanding of that characteristic. I think that is all of the questions that I see. Shane is telling me that's it. So thank you guys for hanging out and drinking American Porter with me. Next week, we're going to be doing German Pils, which is, as some of you may guess, like very much a personal favorite of mine due to its supreme crushability. Summer's kind of drawing to a close, even though it doesn't feel like it because I haven't been able to like go enjoy it like I normally would. But I can't think of a better way to sort of wrap up August, begin September than having some German Pils together. So hope to see you guys next week. Thanks for stopping by.